two struggling brothers, one decision on the side of the road, and a dying man who changed everything. They saved his life, unaware that he held the key to their own fate, but the price they would have to pay, no one could have seen coming. Brooklyn was freezing at dawn, the streets still damp with dew, and yellow streetlights strung across rooftops hadn't yet flickered out. Two old bicycles creaked rhythmically, their rusty chains screeching over potholes and broken bricks. On one, Zephyr Knox, 18, hunched low, his face stung raw by the biting wind. Beside him, Cassian Knox, 15, pedaled close, his scrawny arms trembling under a faded hoodie. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Time was rushing like blood in their ears, and if they were late, they could lose the only job keeping their family alive day by day. The cracked screen of Cassian's phone flashed. 3 minutes, he muttered. I know, Zephyr gritted, pedaling harder. They were headed to Tucker Mart, a rundown shop where the boss, Harlan Griggs, was notorious for zero tolerance. 1 minute late and you'd be erased from the payroll. Their mother, Isolde Knox, couldn't work anymore since her heart condition flared up. Their 10-year-old sister, Leora, stayed home to care for her. Medicine, rent, utilities, all rested on these two exhausted pairs of legs. But then Zephyr saw it, a black Cadillac, its body crumpled, nose down in a ditch by the road. The windshield was shattered, steam rising from the hood. On the ground, a man, middle-aged, gray suit, bloodied, lay motionless, his leg twisted grotesquely. His breath was faint as smoke, his lips barely forming a sound. Help me. Cassian glanced at his watch. 2 minutes. Zephyr looked at the man, then at his brother. No, forget work. He leapt off his bike, rushing to the man's side, while Cassian cursed and tossed his bike down. Each attempt to lift the man drew groans, more blood seeping. Use the bikes, Zephyr said. Lay him across the frame, wheel him. Dumbest idea I've ever heard, Cassian grumbled. Got a better one? No. They laid the bikes flat, hoisted the man onto them, and started pushing. The weight felt like a building. 4 blocks stretched like 4 years. Each jolt made the man moan, each bump screamed in their backs. But the hospital was in sight, and they didn't stop, not when someone's life depended on the hands of 2 boys society never deemed trustworthy. No one looked at them when they arrived. Not a greeting, not a nod. Only the cold beep of the barcode scanner echoed from behind the dusty glass door. Zephyr Knox and Cassian Knox stood panting, shirts soaked with sweat, their bikes propped hastily against the brick wall. They both knew they were too late, but they clung to a sliver of hope that Harlan Griggs hadn't checked his watch today, that the decent thing they'd done might earn a moment's understanding. They stepped inside. The stench of cheap bleach, burnt coffee, and wilted produce hit them. Coworkers glanced. One near sympathetic nod, one deliberate turn away. Silence hung over the store like a trap ready to snap. Knox boys, a shout from the back. Rooms slammed into their skulls like a hammer. Harlan Griggs appeared, face flushed, his tight shirt straining, a cigarette pinched between 2 fat fingers despite the no smoking sign behind him. His steps thudded like war drums, smoke curling with every furious breath. Who do you think you are, showing up 30 minutes late? He snarled. Before Zephyr could speak, a veiny hand waved him off. Don't give me excuses. This is a job, not a charity. We saved someone, Cassian blurted, lips tight. Oh, how touching. Harlan's laugh was dry, his eyes cold as steel. Did he pay your wages? Did he fill the gap in this morning's shift? No one answered. Harlan nodded. Good. Get out. You're fired. Zephyr's fists clenched, but his voice stayed low. We'll just grab our stuff. Smart move. Harlan turned, walking off as if they'd never existed. Behind them, the others' stares weighed like stones. No one spoke, no one helped. They passed the shelves, cold fluorescent lights glaring down on their bowed heads. Nothing left to hold onto, nothing left to beg for. Back at the apartment, Isolde Knox sat at the old dining table. Hospital bills were spread out like a battlefield about to ignite. She didn't need to ask. Fired? Her voice was hoarse but not accusing. Cassian nodded, his eyes clouded. They told her everything, the wrecked car, the dying man, how they pushed through every street, and how Harlan Griggs tossed them out like garbage. Isolde listened. She didn't interrupt. When they finished, she said only, "You did the right thing, and doing right sometimes doesn't mean being forgiven." The apartment sank into silence, but within, something still smoldered. Not anger, but the stubborn pride that refused to die. The apartment seemed to shrink in the darkness. The heater had died that morning. The dim, grimy ceiling lights made everything feel mute. Zephyr Knox sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly between his knees, his back bowed as if crushed by an unseen weight. Each howl of wind outside the window was a slow, fading pulse in his chest. In the living room, Isolde Knox coughed softly, a dry, ominous sound. Leora Knox slept, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, but her sleep was restless, tossing, then gripping the toy tighter. The door creaked open. Cassian Knox stepped in, zipping his hoodie to his chin as if the cold outside still clung to his skin. He stood for a moment, then said, not looking at his brother, "We need money." His voice was hoarse but steady, no tremor. Zephyr didn't answer. He knew. It didn't need saying. The fridge was nearly empty. Their mother's prescriptions sat untouched in their box. No money to fill them. "I know someone," Cassian continued, staring out the window as if the person stood under the street light below. "Jet Callahan. He's got work." Zephyr's head snapped up. His gaze hardened. That name was a knife slicing through old memories. The kind of guy with money. Clean shoes, nice car, new phone. But no one ever saw him step into a place called a job. "No," Zephyr said flatly. "You haven't even heard. Me out." "No need to. Jet Callahan doesn't deal in anything clean." Cassian gripped his backpack strap. "He says it's just some quick jobs, no questions, no answers." He looked at his brother, eyes reddening. "You got another plan? Mom needs meds, rent's due next week." Zephyr stood. His eyes darkened not with anger but fear. Fear of losing Cassian, fear of a path with no return. "You think I don't know that? But there are lines, Cassian. Cross them and you don't come back." The room froze. A long silence stretched. Then Zephyr's voice softened, almost a whisper. "Give me one day. Just one day. Find a way." Cassian didn't answer. He just turned, opened the door, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, a soft sound that hit Zephyr like a gunshot. In the thick night, he knew he had less than 24 hours to save his brother from a darkness he himself had nearly fallen into. The landline rang at 6:07 a.m. Its harsh, jarring sound pierced the quiet air as if something had slipped out of the day's usual rhythm. No one called this line. It was just for bills and junk mail. Zephyr Knox froze for a second before reaching for it, his heart skipping a beat, sensing something stirring in a world they'd never belonged to. "Hello?" His voice was cautious, low by instinct. On the other end, a woman's voice, calm, soft, but firm. "This is Serafina Vale. I believe you and your brother saved my husband Thatcher Vale that morning." The room around Zephyr stilled. His hand gripped the table's edge until his knuckles whitened. "He's alive?" "Stable, awake, and asking about you two." Cassian Knox poked his head out from the other room, hair mussed, eyes still bleary. "Who's that?" Zephyr didn't answer. His ears were locked on the woman's voice, steady, each word like a raindrop on still water. "It took us a while to find you. No one at the hospital knew your names. We had to check security cameras." "Why?" "Because my husband wants to meet the two who saved his life." "So, do I. A car will pick you up at 10 a.m. tomorrow, if you're willing." The call ended with a soft click, like a promise. But to Zephyr, it was the sound of a door cracking open. He set the phone down, his mind reeling between confusion and a strange fear. In a world that usually left people like them behind, Someone had sought them out. The next morning, a sleek black SUV parked outside their run-down building. Cassian hopped off the stoop, eyeing the car like an alien artifact. "Probably a trap. Maybe he died and they're blaming us." "He's not dead," Zephyr said, tugging on his least wrinkled hoodie. "They said he wants to meet us." The car carried them through streets that shifted from broken brick to polished stone, from grimy shops to porches draped in flowers. When they reached the Belmont Hotel, where mirrors reflected chandeliers onto marble floors, they felt like they'd stepped into a world they'd only seen on their old TV. Serafina Vale was waiting. Her gaze was calm, her voice quiet, but commanding attention. "Thank you for coming." The brothers sat, hands on their knees as if afraid to dirty the chairs. "My husband is alive because of you," she said, "and no one in our family will ever forget that." They were speechless. Fairy tales often begin with magic, but here it all started with a single choice to stop. The sound of packing tape echoed steadily in the small apartment, a strange rhythm tapping into faded memories. Old cardboard boxes stacked precariously, their thin walls holding things no one truly wanted to keep but couldn't bear to discard. Cassian Knox crouched, sealing one last box, his back curved like the morning breeze, then looked up, shaking his head. "I still don't believe this is real." "It's real," Zephyr Knox replied softly, sitting by the window, gazing at the trash-strewn alley where the garbage truck never came on time. "And it's coming to get us." Isolde Knox sat by the door, her frail hands loosely clutching her coat's hem. She hadn't spoken this morning. She didn't need to. In her eyes, etched with sleepless nights, was a quiet no words could name. Relief. Leora Knox spun circles in the room, hugging her stuffed rabbit and giggling. "Do you think the new house has a yard? Trees? Windows?" Zephyr didn't answer. He just reached out to ruffle her hair, his eyes misty as he looked at the place they were about to leave. A poor, cold place, but one that had kept them alive. The black SUV arrived on time, its glossy reflection glinting through the apartment's foggy glass like a reminder. It was time. A moving truck pulled up behind it. Uniformed movers stepped carefully across the creaky floor, as if afraid to break something sacred. They didn't have much. A few clothes, some dented pots, a handful of old books. But each item was a witness to the life they'd lived. The new house sat in a quiet neighborhood, with lush green lawns and trees lined up like a painting. When Leora stepped inside, she gasped, "Wow, it's huge." Isolde stood at the threshold for a long time, silent, just staring at the clean walls, glossy wood floors, and a kitchen that actually worked. "It's all yours," a gentle voice said from behind. They turned. Serafina Vale stood there, in a simple white outfit, her smile unpretentious. Zephyr approached, still half believing. "I don't know how to thank you enough. You already have," she replied. Isolde gripped Serafina's hand, her eyes speaking volumes. Two mothers, one who'd nearly lost everything, one who'd almost lost her husband, now touched hands, as if two worlds met at a crossroads. Before leaving, Serafina said to the brothers, "This is a new chapter. Don't just live in it. Write it." And as the door closed, the scent of fresh wood, sunlight, and peace seeped into every breath. For the first time in their lives, the house smelled of hope. The iron gate opened slowly, no creak like in their old neighborhood, just a small, crisp click, clean and perfect. Zephyr Knox gripped his backpack strap, stepping onto the Danforth Academy courtyard like he was treading the threshold of a world he'd only glimpsed in borrowed library books. The sky that day was high, clear, and an unsettling blue. Ivory flagpoles fluttered lightly in the breeze, and the students around them walked with straight backs as if the universe itself was built to serve their classes. Cassian Knox trailed behind. His new shoes still stiff, soles clacking on the paved stone, making him feel like everyone was staring. "We stick out like paint smudges on an oil painting," he muttered. Zephyr didn't reply, not because he disagreed, but because he didn't want to hear what he knew was true. The hallway smelled of lemon and new books. Wooden plaques displayed crests and photos of students with national awards, names in gold letters. No one named Knox, no one like them. Lunch was the worst. The cafeteria was so vast it swallowed sound, its glossy brown leather chairs gleaming. Students clustered at tables, speaking in low, deliberate tones, used to being heard. Zephyr and Cassian sat at the end of a long table, their two trays of food isolated, no one striking up a conversation. A few glances came their way, not scornful, not friendly, the kind of looks from people who'd once toured a poor neighborhood and didn't know how to act. "Feels like charity," Cassian said, tapping his finger on the tray's edge. Zephyr stayed silent. He felt it. Every whisper, every glance, like tiny needles piercing his skin. But in his mind, Serafina Vale's voice still echoed, "This is a new chapter. Don't just live in it, write it." "We're not here to fit in," Zephyr said, quiet but clear. "We're here to start." Cassian looked at his brother, the usual mocking glint in his eyes softening for the first time. "Fine, but if one more kid calls me urban like it's a compliment, I swear I'll swing." Zephyr let out a small laugh. Just a flicker. No one at Danforth laughed with them, but in that moment, amid strange walls and voices cold as stone, two boys the world had once left behind chose to stay, not to blend in, but to carve their own path. Danforth Academy had something Zephyr Knox wasn't used to: silence. Not the grim, impoverished silence of their old apartment, but a weighty silence, bought with money and tradition, where every sound had to be timed and proper. Yet in those heavy pauses, Zephyr found something unexpected: space to hear himself. He sat in English literature class, flipping through pages, but his eyes lingered on Langston Hughes' poetry, his heart slowing with each line. He wasn't trying to understand. He was living in it. When the bell rang, Mr. Becker, the literature teacher, approached his desk, resting a hand lightly on its edge, careful not to impose. "Can you stay a moment?" Zephyr tensed. Past experiences at his old school taught him staying after class rarely meant good news. But Mr. Becker just smiled, his eyes glinting as if seeing something no one else had. "Have you considered applying to Washington University?" The question hung in the air like a strange lamp flickering in a dim room. "That school," Zephyr echoed. As if, needing to confirm it wasn't a joke. "Yes, they're looking for students like you. Ones who don't just study, but know why they're studying." At home, Zephyr said nothing. He sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting his shadow long across the steps. His hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the brochures Mr. Becker had given him. Inside, Cassian Knox played music, muttering through an essay. He still grumbled, but Zephyr noticed. His brother had started holding his head higher in class, raising his hand, no longer avoiding mirrors. "Maybe we can actually stay here," Zephyr murmured, almost to himself. He didn't dare call it a dream. Just a door slightly ajar, a strange breeze slipping through the crack. But for the first time, Zephyr Knox felt he might cross a line the world had always told him he'd never reach. And the unthinkable sometimes begins with a simple question: have you considered applying? That afternoon, Zephyr Knox didn't take the bus straight home. Instead of turning right down the clean, stone-paved road to their new neighborhood, he turned left, back to what used to be everything. The old block stood unchanged, sagging like unpolished memories. Graffiti-streaked walls, the smell of motor oil, the faint whiff of pho from the corner shop, it was all the same. Either no one had the time to change it, or no one cared to. Zephyr walked through the familiar alley, once called the dead end by others, but to him back then it was the only place he felt worth something, even if only in the eyes of people like Jet Callahan. And there he was, leaning against the wall, same old leather jacket, his gaze steady enough to make the kids around him shrink. The children, 13, maybe younger, clustered near Jet, eyes wide, hands shoved deep in pockets, listening as if he were preaching the laws of survival. Zephyr didn't need to hear it. He knew the pitch. Quick money, no hassle, no questions. And the cost? Never spoken aloud, but anyone who'd fallen in knew. "Hey!" Zephyr's voice cut through, calm, clear. The group turned. Jet's eyes locked onto his, lips curling like he'd spotted an old game returning. "Look who it is, Mr. Danforth Academy." Zephyr didn't return the smile. He looked straight at the kids, his voice low. "You kids go home. This place isn't for you." A few hesitated. One boy glanced at Jet for approval, but in Zephyr's eyes there was something different. Not a threat, not fear, but certainty of the outcome. "You think these kids'll listen to you?" Jet said, his laugh thin as smoke. "They see you with your pressed shirt, clean backpack. You're not part of this anymore." "You're right," Zephyr replied, stepping forward, his voice low but sharp. "I'm not. But I know where this place leads, and I won't let another kid walk in without knowing what they're falling into." A moment passed. Then, tentative footsteps. One kid, then two, then the whole group quietly slipped away, darting past him like a cold, fleeting breeze. Jet's smile faded. He shoved his hands in his pockets, eyes darkening. "You think they'll let you stay out there forever?" "Maybe not," Zephyr answered. "But I know I'm not coming back." And in the slanting afternoon light against the stained brick wall, Zephyr Knox turned away, not to escape, but to keep walking, more resolute than ever. The late winter sky was draped in thin, cold clouds, not biting, just crisp. On the porch of the new house, Zephyr Knox sat alone, holding an envelope with a creased edge, his eyes fixed on the printed words in his palm. No cheers, no one to embrace him, just steady breaths and a faintly trembling hand, as if his body couldn't yet believe what was undeniable. "Congratulations, you have been accepted to Washington University with a full scholarship." Inside, soft music drifted from the living room. Cassian Knox tapped his fingers on the keyboard, working on an essay while humming to the tune. These past few weeks, he'd stopped complaining every morning, stopped mocking when teachers mentioned assignments, just quietly raised his hand, quietly tried. Some changes come without fanfare, only in new habits forming, and Zephyr had seen it all. A soft step sounded behind him. He turned. Serafina Vale stood there, unannounced, as if the wind had guided her. She wore nothing extravagant, just a simple cream coat, her eyes like mirrors reflecting what others still hid. "You kept your promise," she said. Zephyr's brow furrowed slightly. "Did I promise something?" Serafina stepped closer, not to scold, but to remind. "That day, I asked one thing. When it's your turn, help someone else." Zephyr paused. Then he remembered. The kids in the dark alley, their wary eyes and hesitant steps as he told them to turn back. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, just spoken from the truth he'd lived. "I didn't realize I was doing that," he whispered. She smiled, saying nothing more, just nodded, then turned away, leaving Zephyr with the letter still cradled in his hand and the vast sky stretching before him. That evening, Isolde Knox sat in the armchair, Leora Knox asleep with her head on her mother's lap, lips still twitching as if dreaming something sweet. Cassian stepped out from the other room, looking at his brother by the window, the golden lamplight catching half his face. "Washington University, huh?" Zephyr turned. His eyes shimmered with a light that only comes after crossing countless dark nights. "Yeah." No more words were needed. They both knew he hadn't just overcome hardship. He'd kept a promise once thought as fleeting as the wind. Spring arrived quietly, not the boisterous version from TV ads, nor the flower-drenched scenes of postcards, but enough to warm the old walls, to let light seep into corners once steeped in gloom. Zephyr Knox sat on the porch steps, holding the letter from Washington. Not to reread it this time, but to close his eyes and remember. The morning the Cadillac lay wrecked in a ditch, the bloodied hands, the faint moans, the choice to stop when they could have kept going and no one would have blamed them. Inside, Isolde Knox let out a soft laugh as she folded the newspaper. She was stronger now, No more coughing fits in the night, no more ashen pallor when meds were delayed. Her cheeks were rosier, her posture steadier. On the floor, Leora Knox sprawled, coloring pictures, her old stuffed rabbit now joined by a new bear, though she still whispered to her toys, crafting her own world in her quiet way. Cassian Knox passed by the porch, arms full of books, earbuds in, muttering lines for a history presentation on war. He paused, glanced at his brother, and gave a slight nod. No words needed, that look said it all. We did it, and we're still going. Zephyr watched him, then looked up at the clear sky. We can't choose where we're born, he murmured, as if sending the words into the breeze. But we can always choose who we become. As evening fell, sunlight streamed through the window, spilling onto the clean floor of a home they once couldn't have dreamed of. No one in the house mentioned Harlan Griggs or the damp alley of their past, but they all knew, if they hadn't stopped that day, none of this would exist. One act, not for reward, not for gratitude, had changed everything. And as Zephyr Knox stood carefully folding the letter, he knew this more surely than anything he'd learned in school. Doing the right thing doesn't always bring instant results, but it plants seeds, quiet, steadfast, for something far more beautiful. A legacy doesn't begin with wealth, fame, or lineage. It starts with a choice, the right one, when no one demands it. From there it spreads, like the wind, like light, like the name he carried, Zephyr. Some stories don't need miracles, just the right choice made in a moment no one expects. The journey of Zephyr Knox and Cassian Knox began with a pool of blood on the side of the road, a dying stranger, and ended at the gates of a university that opened a future they had never dared to dream of. But what moves us isn't the beautiful ending. It's how they walked through the darkness, being fired by Harlan Griggs for saving a life, facing temptation from Jet Callahan, enduring the isolation at Danforth Academy, and still choosing to keep going, to live with integrity, even when no one asked them to. It was the quiet strength of Zold Knox, the unwavering innocence of little Leora Knox, and the timely support of Serafina Vale that wove this path together. And it was Zephyr, with the same hands that once pushed a bleeding man on the frame of a bicycle, who laid the first brick in a legacy that bears no name, only one truth: kindness. Thank you for watching Millionaire and Heart Stories. We hope today's story touched something deep within you, the part that still believes a single act of compassion can change the course of an entire life. See you in the next journey, where ordinary people do extraordinary things, simply by refusing to turn away when the world tells them to.